Plenty of news, let's face it, passes us by without really affecting our lives. Occasionally, though, there are events that seem to reach out and touch us. In Britain this year, we've perhaps had more than our usual share of news that has grabbed our personal attention and threatened to change the way we lead our lives, which is where we begin, with a horror story that gripped our attention in 1996 and has still not let it go.
Peter Hall died in February, shortly before his 21st birthday. He was suffering from a new strain of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, a rare and terrible ailment.
He was coming down the stairs and he seemed to be rolling from side to side. And I said, Peter, what's the matter with you? I'm not very well.
He had a terrible look in his eye, a look of horror, really. He must have been having nightmares. We put it down to nightmares, hallucinations, something that he never explained.
Under the microscope, the damage is clear. The brain becomes spongy with visible holes. Previous sufferers had mostly been elderly, so the sudden appearance in Britain of a cluster of cases involving young people astonished the scientists.
When we studied the pathology, it seemed that it was completely different from anything else I'd ever seen. And my colleagues and I were very surprised by this, although at the time we didn't know exactly how to interpret it.
They came to the conclusion that the source of the disease was probably infected beef. The government had always said that there was no scientific evidence of a link between CJD and BSE, a disease of cattle. In March came the fateful announcement that the government's own advisory committee had changed its mind.
There remains no scientific proof that BSE can be transmitted to man by beef, but the committee have concluded that the most likely explanation at present is that these cases are linked to exposure to BSE before the introduction of the specified bovine offal ban in 1989.
The specified bovine offal ban was one of a number of regulations to protect the food chain from BSE. The parts of the animal that might carry the disease were being isolated and cut out by the butchers. The government thought that these measures made beef eaten this year safe. But the public thought otherwise. They chopped beef off the menu. Sales plummeted.
Panic on the streets of London. Panic on the streets of Birmingham. I wonder to myself, could life ever be sane again?
Restaurants and shops from the top end of the market to the bottom avoided British beef. Some accused them of commercial cowardice, but they pointed to the public mood, a mood that said, play safe.
We serve nearly 2 million people every day. The trust and confidence of those people is my primary responsibility.
Come on, girls. Come on.
In Britain, at least, trust and confidence was beginning to return. Sales back to more than 80% of their pre-crisis levels. Ministers did their best to encourage the trend.
The best available evidence demonstrates that British beef and beef products can be safely eaten by consumers both here and around the world.
But from across the Channel came the bombshell that turned a domestic crisis into a Euro war. The Europeans placed a worldwide ban on British beef. The Germans led the way.
Who do you think you are kidding, Mr. Hitler, if you think we're on the run?
I'm sorry to say so, but to my opinion, Great Britain has announced a couple of things, but there hasn't been any real action.
We are the boys who will stop your little game. We are the boys who...
The Europeans complained that their consumers had gone off beef, and the only answer was to persuade them that there was no chance of mistakenly buying British. Mr. Major was livid. At the Florence summit, a truce was arranged.
I think everybody wanted to see whether a sensible, rational, common-sense agreement could be reached, and I think that is precisely what we've managed to obtain today, and I'm very pleased about that.
But new research suggested that BSE might die away naturally, and though 1 million older cattle have now been slaughtered, the selective cull agreed at Florence was delayed, while politicians argued about whether or not it was necessary. Meanwhile, we wait to discover how many more people will die. Towards the end of the year, there were wide-ranging predictions. All of them, it turned out, premature.
It's frustrating, but I think the only honest answer is to say it's too early to tell. We may just be seeing those cases who have a very short incubation period. In any epidemic, there's a great range of incubation periods in individual cases. And we don't know what the average incubation period is going to be. And that's a critical determinant of how many cases. So I think we have to wait for another 6 or 12 months before we can begin to narrow down the range of possibilities.
And even if an epidemic is avoided, terrible damage has already been done.
They might say it's a small risk, but it hasn't been a small risk for us. We've lost 1 out of 2 sons, and it's a big risk.
We used to call CJD the human equivalent of mad cow disease, and it sounded faintly comical. It doesn't anymore.
If you put 2 and 2 together, you will see what our friendship is for. Oh, if you can work this equation, then I guess I'll have to show you the door. There is no need to say you love me. It would be better left unsaid. I'm giving you all the joy
April, the Queen was 70. Celebrations were cheerful, but low-key. A planned birthday meal in a restaurant had to be cancelled when the papers found out. The Queen spent the year doing her job, doing it as she always has. But amid the traditional trappings, there were thoughts about the future of the monarchy. It was revealed that the Queen held regular family meetings to discuss reforms. A biographer raised the intriguing issue of whether the Queen was, as he put it, a bit of a lefty. We don't know. The Queen understands the value of discretion. The younger female royals were on a different wavelength. Would she or wouldn't she divorce the prince? She did, taking with her £17 million, the final act in a long goodbye. Diana did not go quietly. She resigned from 100 charities and concentrated on the few that she particularly liked. They tended to be high profile. This was not to be a new life of private good works. The princess dominated the headlines even when the stories weren't true. Another divorce blew another hole in the mystique of royalty. Fergie didn't go quietly either. In fact, she went noisily. First, the money problems. And then worse. And finally, the books, with her own effort topping the pile. One reader, at least, was impressed.
I'm so sad. You know, I read Hello magazine with my own story in it and cried twice because it's all so tragically sad.
But you don't have the man. I mean, we want you to have the man.
I do have the man. He's my best friend.
Would you go back to him?
I think we take every day as we come. But he's my best friend, and we're both very good parents to our children, and that's the way it is. Who knows what tomorrow will bring?
I trusted him then, I trust him now. I'm very pleased that we are here standing together to be able to say this to you. Thanks very much.
It's a victory for justice, a victory for the people of East Timor.
On his bowling, Botham's gone. beaten there with a fine delivery. A little bit of extra pace too. Seemed to have been in fact beaten by the pace. And a great feather in Imran's cap to get rid of Ian Botham.
Those who lost a dear one clearly have a journey to make through their grief. The survivors who lost their innocence that dreadful morning, whose lives are scarred, they also have a journey to make. And all of us who have shared the horror must make our journey out of that horror into a safer and a more civilized society.
The situation is still confused, and so far it's not been possible to confirm the extent of the casualties.
Families began to leave their homes and make their way to the primary school.
minutes, the gunman then shot himself dead.
A day in March, a day that began in confusion and ended in grief.
Some parents were called out almost immediately, and the rest of us were left sitting. Eventually, we were called out, the rest of the families were called out in family groups, and I was called out about 2:20 to 3, to be told that Sophie had been killed.
Sophie North was 5 years old. 2 years ago, her mother died of cancer. She was Mick North's only child. Mary Macbeath survived for only a short time, dying of her wounds in hospital.
I know that she was shot only once and that it was a head wound. I have been told by members of my family who are doctors that she would have been unconscious very quickly.
Thomas Hamilton killed 16 children and their teacher before shooting himself. He had lived an isolated life, pursuing twin obsessions. The first with young boys. He'd set up military-style clubs for them. And the second obsession was with guns. He owned several, all of them licensed and legal.
Sometimes it seems that grief gives people an almost superhuman strength, a determination that you don't see in ordinary life. The parents of Dunblane focused their energies on a campaign against gun ownership, which was to have far-reaching results. Then, later in the year, theirs was joined by another campaign, again focused on weapons, again forged in grief.
The widow of the London head teacher Philip Lawrence wanted knives like the one used to kill her husband banned, and she had a wider vision as well.
We have to sort out this growth of violence, and it has to be stopped. And I think we'd be failing ourselves in our duties as citizens if we didn't at least try very hard.
The debate had moved on now from the issue of a madman's access to weapons to one of why so many sane people, especially young people, seemed so violent. The riding school in South Yorkshire, unfairly perhaps, was singled out as an example of the malaise. Calmer voices suggested we took a step back and looked not just at our children, but at ourselves and the things we value.
The problem that's facing us is the problem that's actually facing every developed society in one form and another, which is what are the sources of human respect in a society which is based and has found its ways of running itself on the basis of economic efficiency. The sense I get, and it fills me obviously with both sadness and alarm, is that there are young people to whom society and the world they find themselves makes no sense except in terms of domination, of cutting some violent figure, because there's nothing else that bears any meaning to them.
Sombre thoughts raised in an often sombre year, a year in which the availability of weapons and the prevalence of violence has caused us much anguish.
Five.
3, 2, 1, ignition.
Four. 3. 2. 1.
Tous les paramètres propulsifs sont normaux et la trajectoire est normale.
Things did not get easier in Russia in 1996. In fact, if anything, life got tougher. The year began violently, with rebels fighting for Chechen independence, seizing a hospital and 2,000 hostages. The hostage takers thought they'd negotiated their freedom. But they didn't get far. The Russians surrounded them and used the military might of a former superpower to exact their revenge. Hostages and hostage-takers alike were on the receiving end of the bombardment. It looked as incompetent as it was brutal. Next, the Chechens captured a ferry in a Turkish Black Sea port. It was a high-profile stunt with, this time, a peaceful ending, as the hijackers gave themselves up. It was all too much for many Russians. They marched to the old anthems and hoped for a return of the old ways. The communists looked likely to depose President Yeltsin in the summer elections. They reckoned without the power of the media, particularly television, over which Yeltsin had a stranglehold. Opposition parties found themselves off the news. The tame broadcasters went to work on Yeltsin's behalf. The president's opponents tried, but they couldn't keep up. Round one went Yeltsin's way, but not by enough, so he struck a deal with a powerful challenger, the popular and populist General Lebed, appointing him national security chief. The reformer and the tough guy, a marriage of huge convenience. The communist leader, Gennady Zyuganov, battled on, and many Russians backed him to the end. But Yeltsin was unstoppable now. The red flag would not be raised.
So, with a mixture of aggressive campaigning and artful dealing, Boris Yeltsin made it back to the Kremlin. For his supporters, and certainly for Western governments, there was a feeling of relief. A feeling that the threat of a return to communism had passed, at least for the foreseeable future. But this is Russia, whose gloomy history decrees that one crisis follows hard on the heels of another. And so it was that at the very moment of his victory, it became obvious that the president was gravely ill.
Президента Российской Федерации.
At the swearing-in for the second term, Yeltsin did not dance. Indeed, he seemed barely able to speak. It was a charade, a Soviet-style pretense that all was well, when plainly it wasn't. For weeks, Russia was in the dark. The president was said to be resting. Rumour and counter-rumour swirled around the Kremlin, but nobody knew for sure what was happening. In Chechnya, General Lebed signed a peace deal with the rebels, telling them generals make good politicians. Mr. Yeltsin smelt danger and sacked him. He left the scene, at least for the time being. By now, the announcement had been made that the president needed heart surgery, and early on a November morning, he was taken to hospital for the operation that would decide Russia's immediate future. Prime Minister Chernomyrdin gathered up the reins of power, including for a short time the Russian nuclear button. But not for the first time, Yeltsin bounced back. His family at his side, the president emerged from his hospital bed and declared himself fighting fit. Now he needs to deliver. Russians voted him back, but plenty are already protesting about the lives he is letting them lead. Russia's democracy isn't safe yet, though at least in 1996 it was given another chance to prove itself. On the other side of what was once the superpower divide, it was also time to choose. As the worst snow in more than a century swirled around the White House, the president was planning his biggest ever comeback. Even before the snows had thawed, the Republicans were on the run. Bob Dole launched his primary campaign with regulation razzmatazz, but nobody quite knew why he wanted to be president. Among his opponents, the millionaire Steve Forbes proposed a flat rate of income tax, and the right-winger Pat Buchanan showered rhetorical fire and brimstone. In the end, the Second World War hero won through for, as he put it, one last mission for his country.
Tonight I stand before you, tested by adversity, made sensitive by hardship, a fighter by principle, and the most optimistic man in America.
Dole chose Jack Kemp as his running mate, a man who'd been a bitter enemy in the past. The best choice, General Colin Powell, attended the Republican convention but wouldn't join the ticket. Dole took to the road, but the campaign went nowhere. Content unconvincing, imagery unflattering.
Ladies and gentlemen, William Jefferson Clinton.
The president, meanwhile, looked presidential. He said he admired Dole's old-fashioned virtues.
But with all respect, we do not need to build a bridge to the past. We need to build a bridge to the future, and that is what I commit to you to do.
Hi, folks.
There was a policy debate of sorts, but nothing to set the pulse racing. and Hillary Clinton, potentially risky, was kept off the podium. There was a slight hiccup when questions were raised about the financing of the whole show. Officials took the rap. Nothing stuck to Bill Clinton. As election day arrived, the result looked pretty obvious. Only half of those eligible bothered to vote.
We must make our democracy stronger.
But for the president, it was a victory to savour. Only 2 years ago, he'd been all but written off as the Republicans stormed Congress. Now, though the Republicans held on to the House and Senate, they had to accept that their much vaunted revolution had fizzled out.
Still, there was one group of Conservatives living thousands of miles from here who could afford to smile on the Clinton victory. The British Conservatives don't think much of the president himself, but they liked the sight of a political miracle taking place. They enjoyed the fact that an incumbent who had been very unpopular managed to win, to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat.
You said my clothes were sexy. You tore away my shirt.
The Conservatives unveil their secret weapon. They think it's awesome. With its jacket off, it can charm an audience at 50 paces.
Because you're gorgeous, I'd do anything for you.
Did you enjoy it?
It's camouflaged in ordinariness, but underneath it is a fighting machine. It became clear in 1996 that John Major was the only choice to lead his party into the election, but the view from his limousine has been obscured again this year. The Conservatives began the year fending off charges of dirty dealing. An inquiry had been going on into allegations that ministers had lied about arms sales to Iraq. The government's enemies hoped it would blow a supergun-sized hole through the administration. But Sir Richard Scott, the inquiry's bicycling chairman, produced a finely balanced report. Ministers were criticised, but there was no killer blow, no smoking supergun, and no resignations. The focus of what the critics termed sleaze now turned to Paris. The former minister Neil Hamilton had been accused by the Guardian newspaper of accepting money and a holiday at the Paris Ritz in return for asking parliamentary questions on behalf of the owner of the hotel, Mohammed Al Fayed. Mr. Hamilton was groomed ready for battle, but at the last minute, legal action against the Guardian was dropped. And that wasn't the end of the matter. A former whip, David Willits, was accused of trying to influence the outcome of a Commons investigation into the Hamilton affair. A memo he had written was scrutinised.
You say, Mr. Willits, you didn't falsify and you didn't invent, but just take a look at the first line of the next paragraph. Either you were deceiving your colleagues or you were trying to deceive this committee now.
No, I explain in my memorandum to this committee, the circumstances of the events of 2 years ago.
Thank you, John. I think
very reluctant.
Mr. Willits eventually resigned after the committee accused him of dissembling, another nasty moment for the Conservatives.
It usefully can.
Outside Parliament, what did the voters think of all this? Basildon is the Tories' spiritual home. Its inhabitants have enjoyed Tory rule. But in 1996, Essex girls became unfaithful, and Essex boys too. Basildon ditched all but one of its Tory councillors at the local elections. Around the country, the Tories lost more than half of the seats they were defending, their share of the vote only just above the Liberal Democrats. With the election clock ticking, ministers looked for measures that would bring their supporters back. The Home Secretary, catchphrase, prison works, wants minimum sentences for some repeat offenders. The country's most senior judge was scathing. It would be, he said, a denial of justice. Mr. Howard, though, was not to be deflected, as his party sought to put a thin blue line between themselves and Labour. But the Tories' biggest battle centred on Europe.
They're seeking a referendum so the people can decide the future of Britain within Europe. We need that.
Some Conservatives flirted with Sir James Goldsmith, who had demanded a referendum on our relationship with Europe. Mr. Major promised one on the issue of a single currency if we decided to join. Labour followed suit, so the Tory right demanded an ever tougher line against the euro. All year they hit out at the Chancellor, all year he hit back. At the conference there was talk of coming together and focusing on a common enemy. But although no Conservative wants to be blamed for jeopardising the election, left and right are still daggers drawn, with Mr. Major still in the middle.
Well, I don't know why I came here tonight. I got the feeling that something ain't right. I'm so scared in case I fall off my chair, and I'm wondering how I'll get down the stairs. Clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with you. Yes, I'm stuck in the middle with you. Yes, I'm stuck in the middle with you.
The Conservatives could not be described as a happy family, but they are the party of government, they know how to win elections, and they've not given up yet. Northern Ireland's year began with the felling of a Christmas tree, an apt symbol for the mood of the months ahead. The tree had been a gift from President Clinton, who'd visited the province that winter and told the terrorists, "You are the past, your day is over." The IRA's reply came on the 9th of February. 500 pounds of explosives planted in the London Docklands. There'd been a coded warning, but it hadn't been possible to get everyone out of the way.
Whilst I was actually speaking, the bomb actually went off. The entire building shook. Shelves flew off of the wall behind me that were fixed to the wall. All the drawers fell over, ceiling tiles came down.
Dozens were injured and 2 men lost their lives. As the nation surveyed the wreckage, Sinn Féin were on the defensive. If the IRA's political wing knew about the bomb, then they were accessories to murder. If they didn't know, then perhaps the IRA was elbowing them aside.
People need to recognise that if Sinn Féin is to play any meaningful and constructive role in the future in attempting to resolve this conflict, then the road of condemnation is one that people should not ask us to go down. That is not productive at all.
Another death followed soon. Edward O'Brien had caught a bus into central London, clutching the bomb he intended to plant. It exploded, killing him. The IRA were back in business. The government had been demanding that they handed over weapons before talks. The terrorists said no. Earlier, the American statesman George Mitchell had proposed a compromise on the weapons issue. The government moved towards accepting it, setting a date for talks to be preceded by elections. At those elections, Sinn Féin did well, increasing their share of the vote. Their jubilant supporters demanded a place at the talks, but without a new IRA ceasefire, they were excluded. The talks began, but with Sinn Féin's representatives locked outside. The IRA's Manchester bomb could have been a catastrophe. "200 people were injured, a shopping centre devastated, but miraculously, this time, there were no deaths." Summer brought the focus of events back here to Northern Ireland, and before long to this road in the village of Drumcree. The traditional marching season had begun, and loyalist Orangemen wanted to parade here, but the police said no. The route they'd chosen went past a nationalist housing estate, and they were asked to find another way. So often in Northern Ireland, finding another way, trying another approach, seeking some sort of compromise, is seen as a sign of weakness. And anyone who thought that in 1996 things would be different had their hopes dashed in Drumcree. The Orangemen told the police that they would not back down. To do so would be to betray their history. The faces of the marchers said it all. It was an Ulster standoff. No surrender, no compromise. The security forces seemed at first equally determined. There were days and nights of defiant talk and the occasional skirmish. Then the police made a decision that was to send shockwaves throughout Ireland. They said they feared the uncontrollable consequences of continuing the standoff, and they decided to let the marchers through. On the nationalist estate, they protested, but their numbers were small. They could be controlled, and they were.
Outrageous! This is outrageous what's happening in Portadown.
The protesters were penned back and the loyalists marched through. Around Northern Ireland there were riots, the worst for many years. Nationalists were united in their fury, directed at the police but also at the British government. The Irish Prime Minister could barely contain his anger.
People look to a police force and to a government in any democracy to be impartial, not to be willing to yield to pressure, and to be consistent. And on all three counts, the forces of order and the government failed on those in Northern Ireland in the last few days.
By the autumn, the IRA was killing again inside Northern Ireland. 2 bombs at the Army's main base at Lisburn. The second designed to catch those helping the injured from the first. There was no warning. A soldier was killed. In recent weeks, there's been talk of renewing the IRA ceasefire, but not to much effect. At best, Ulster's New Dawn is on hold. At worst, it is slipping away.
That's where we are. On a stable world in a universe of antimatter. Here we are. Kidnapped and marooned. But by whom?
Hi. Yes, folks, this is a big one. One of the high spot lights of the week.
I think it's almost impossible to play a character unless you have some of the things that make you feel absolutely like the character.
I say never give up hope unless you are just on the last little drop of life you have in you. Never give up.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the opening ceremony of the Centennial Olympic Games.
Atlanta staged the 26th Olympic Games, opened with typical American understatement. One of the great showmen of sport, Muhammad Ali, lit the flame, but he was plainly very ill, and before long the Games too was struggling. Britain's only gold was won by Redgrave and Pinsent in the rowing.
Gold medals! Stephen Redgrave, Matthew Pinsent, mission accomplished.
Redgrave proving himself our only reliable winner, 4 golds in 4 Olympics.
Anyone sees me go anywhere near a boat, you've got my permission to shoot me. I do not ever want to get in a boat again.
He was on the water again within months, to no one's surprise. Athletics, usually our strong card, was disastrous.
Another false start, and out he goes.
Linford Christie was defending his 100 metres gold, but 2 false starts got him eliminated, and he took it badly. Sally Gunnell started all right, but she didn't finish. A tendon injury did for her. Jonathan Edwards, the triple jump world champion, hadn't managed to lose in a year. He did this time.
That is Jonathan Edwards, very nearly at his best. Oh.
He got silver. So did Steve Backley in the javelin and Roger Black in the 400 metres. Away from the sport, disaster struck. A nighttime concert was targeted by bombers. Terrorism had come once again to American streets. 2 people were killed and the showcase was shattered. They carried on as best they could, but no amount of glitz at the closing ceremony could cover Britain's woeful performance. 36th in the medal tables, just ahead of Belarusia. We weren't the only unhappy ones. Much of the organisation of the Games had been shambolic, and the Olympic president himself pointedly withheld the traditional accolade of the greatest Games ever.
Thanks to you, the Centennial Games, the Games of Unity, have indeed been most exceptional games. Thank you.
Unusually, it was Wimbledon that made British breath quicken. Tim Henman made it through to the quarter-finals, a Briton on centre court, and it looked as if he knew what he was doing.
What a match!
Henman lost eventually to Todd Martin.
7 for Frankie!
Frankie Dettori became the housewives' favourite and the bookies' worst nightmare when he won 7 out of 7 races at Ascot in September. And Nick Faldo won the Masters in the last holes, coming from 6 shots behind Greg Norman. No one, including Faldo, could quite believe it. The most amazing turnaround of the year came in the world of rugby, which had been 2 worlds. League and Union got together after a 100-year separation, with Wigan and Bath playing a match in each code. Rugby, as they say, was the winner.
Successful in this first inter-code battle. 82 points to 6.
Frank Bruno is still a winner in Panto, and he's got much more time for his stage career now, after losing his heavyweight title to Mike Tyson and retiring.
Damon Hill is the world champion of 1996.
It's just so fantastic. It was quite a difficult job to concentrate after I heard that Jack was out, but I wanted to win the race, you know, because I knew that was the best way to finish.
The nation's favourite sportsman, Damon Hill, won the last Grand Prix of the season in Japan, and with it the championship. Despite his victory, Damon was dropped from the Williams team. He signed shortly afterwards to TWR Arrows. For many, the event of the year was Euro 96. Football came home, but the home squad were under pressure.
We're not creative enough. We're not positive enough.
England had raised their game. The unthinkable happened. The Dutch annihilated 4-1.
Right in front of the goalkeeper. And Sheringham.
Everyone seems to know the score.
Oh, yes, what a penalty!
Pearce had escaped his past. Semi-finals against Germany. That too went to penalties. It was Gareth Southgate, a defender, who missed. The Germans finished the job.
The Germans go through again. England again suffer the torment of losing in a penalty competition in a semi-final to the Germans.
Germany beat the Czech Republic 2-1 in the final. The end of the competition and the end of Terry Venables' reign as manager. Football had come home and his team had done it justice.
Labour's coming home. 17 years of hurt never stopped us dreaming. Labour's coming home.
A party and a leader oozing confidence, comfortable, even cocky in the limelight.
First it was Stalin, then it was Kim Il-sung, and now it's the devil with the demon eyes. Look, can't we just go back to Bambi?
Eye-catching foreign locations were the backdrop for Tony Blair's high-profile, high-energy year. He used them to launch, if not policies, then visions.
It is what I call a stakeholder economy, in which opportunity is available to all, advancement is through merit, and from which no group or no class of people is excluded.
Mr. Blair put himself about, the mission to be taken seriously and to be seen to be taken seriously by movers and shakers on the international stage. At the home of the most powerful man on earth, Mr. Blair was treated with considerable respect, not always the fate of Labour leaders in the past. In April, the voters had their say, a by-election in Staffordshire South East, which Labour won handsomely.
I declare that the person duly elected to serve as member for the South East Staffordshire constituency is Brian David Jenkins.
Same story for the local elections. Champagne socialism, the order of the day. In the summer, an exercise in party democracy, which Labour's enemies called a sham, the road to the manifesto included 5 pledges which all party members were invited to approve. To nobody's great surprise, they did. The party managers were pleased with this show of unity, which in other areas was not so obvious. Back in January, the first dampener had been Harriet Harman's decision to send her son to a selective grammar school.
Miss Harman, are you going to resign?
Absolutely not.
Mr. Blair chose to back her, hoping to build his own reputation along the way.
Order! Order! Blair!
Well, Madam Speaker, I thank the Prime Minister for his kind words of concern over pressure. The difference between me and him is that I will not buckle under it.
Then there were Claire Short's unspin-doctored views on tax.
I think in a fair tax system, people like me would pay a bit more tax. But I don't think you come and wallop people immediately.
But even that was too much for New Labour. Miss Short, transport spokeswoman, was demoted to the sidings. She was resentful, giving more fuel to the Conservatives, who seized on her complaint that people in the dark controlled Mr. Blair. She did not name names, but others did. Labour's election strategist Peter Mandelson, and Mr. Blair's press secretary Alistair Campbell, receiving more personal attention than they cared for. Trouble in Scotland, too, as Labour's devolution plans were torn up and rewritten, leaving questions about Tony Blair's real intentions. And at Blackpool, as the nights lengthened and the conference season began with the TUC, there were new suggestions that Labour might formally distance itself from its creators. The two sides bickered, and the media had a Labour row to trumpet. At Labour's own conference, a veteran of party strife with the unions took to the podium with a message for today's leaders.
I believe that good debate only strengthens democracy, not weakens it. And I'll tell you one thing, comrade, that debate has put the pensions issue right back in the centre of our politics.
But there were no conference victories for old Labour, save perhaps one sentence in the leader's speech.
But let me say this to you. I don't forget that this party only survived for new members to join because the old members stuck with it through thick and thin.
Who could resist such charm? It was a party now of true believers with a high priest at the helm.
These are the vows that I make to my country. I vow that we will have increased the proportion of our national income we spend on education. I vow that class sizes will be down in primary schools and standards. I vow that we will have reduced the spending on health service bureaucracy and increased it on patient care. That we will have cut the numbers of long-term unemployed. That the promises that we make on tax. This is my covenant with the British people. Judge me upon it. The buck stops here.
Some worry that Mr. Blair's dominance isn't healthy, but most Labour supporters ended 1996 still smiling.
Heavens above, Gromit, look at this! The Israeli army and Hezbollah guerrillas exchanging fire in southern Lebanon. After so much talk of peace, the Middle East edged back towards the continuation of old conflicts. Israel was back in Lebanon, chasing Hezbollah, but all too often harming civilians. And the world community was battling once again to restrain the Israelis. At the UN refugee camp in Qana, Israeli shells killed 100 people, women and children among them. Israel said it was a mistake and apologized.
It's 8 o'clock on Saturday the 20th of January. The headlines this morning: Palestinians are making the most of their new democratic rights by voting for a president and a parliament.
The Palestinians began the year hopefully, giving their fellow Arabs a lesson in democracy. Close on 1 million Palestinians voted under the watchful eye of international observers. It was, they hoped, another step towards statehood.
I feel good. It's the first time that we elect our representative in the council, in the Palestinian Council, and our president here.
Mr. Arafat was still a man of authoritarian habits, but he had now received his people's backing.
88.8% for Mr. Arafat.
As I told you before, I was looking for 51 votes.
But conflict was around the corner. Yechia Ayash, master bomber for the Hamas Islamic fundamentalists, was killed by Israel in an elaborate operation involving a booby-trapped telephone. Grief and rage once again, and promises of revenge. Terrible revenge which shook Israel to the core. Suicide bombers killing more than 50 people in 9 days. Devastation, physical and mental. Many Israelis felt they had taken a chance for peace and had been cruelly repaid. Israel's Prime Minister Shimon Peres had announced an election. His opponent was the right-winger Benjamin Netanyahu. Peres looked for an endorsement of the peace process. Doves and hawks argued bitterly. Knowing the stakes were high, the future of the whole region was in their hands.
I voted for Peres. That's clear and loud.
Likud.
Just Netanyahu. Likud and Bibi. Shimon Peres.
That's Shimon Peres?
Yes. Just Shimon Peres.
The result couldn't have been closer, but Mr. Netanyahu, 46 years old, American-educated and highly telegenic, pipped it. His supporters celebrated what they thought was a safer Israel. But a new crisis soon loomed. An ancient tunnel in Jerusalem's old city, going from the Jewish west into the Arab east, was to be reopened. Palestinians thought it would lead to a further squeeze on their identity. Violence flared, and the Israeli army opened fire. Scenes horribly reminiscent of past years. The fighting spread around the West Bank. The Palestinian police turned their newly acquired weapons on the Israelis. More than 70 people died, and it looked as if the peace process, what was left of it, might itself be mortally wounded. Arafat and Netanyahu, both sullen and unyielding, were summoned to Washington. President Clinton made them talk, but they agreed little.
If progress is to be made, it must come in Hebron, the West Bank town where Israeli troops guard a few hundred Jewish settlers. Hebron was due to be handed to the Palestinians in March, but the negotiations lasted to the end of the year. Compromise has been hard to find.
Are you hurt?
Only my ankle.
May I have your permission to ascertain if there are any breaks?
It's me you need to show. How deep is your love? Oh, yeah. Need to love. 'Cause we're living in a world of fools. They're breaking us down. Gonna stand side, gonna never be denied. You wanna be if you come in. I've been about a feeling I'm lost inside. I've been gonna take me away and hide. I've been that's what's going on.
So what does 1996 add up to? Around the world, it was the year of the vote. Over 1 billion people, from Australia to India, from Russia to Spain, from Israel to the United States, reaffirmed their democracies. They may not have liked the choices on offer, but at least they had a choice to make. It will not have escaped your attention that next year we'll get to make our choices here. And in a sense, the whole of 1996 has been a preparation for that event. The election campaign itself has all but begun, but there's been a wider, perhaps a more interesting debate as well, about the kind of people that we are. There's been a lot of self-analysis here in 1996, and the issues raised in this year are going to be with us for many years to come. Let's finish, though, by looking at some of the things to which we are saying goodbye.
If you heard all they got to say, you look but turn away, just walk away, walk away. If you said all you got to say, now your words just slip away, just walk away, walk away, walk away. That's what they say, what they say.
As 1996 dawned around the world, camera crews from the BBC Natural History Unit were waiting. Together they witnessed the new year. Through 4 seasons, 6 continents and every time zone, beneath the oceans and above the clouds, they watched the world wake up. Join Julian Pettifer for a unique television safari. Global Sunrise, a dawn in the life of the world. New Year's Day at 3:30 on BBC One.
Hi, my name is Tony Farino.
Meet the Portuguese superstar.
Sing, dance, nice job.
As he sings some of his unforgettable hits.
Girls, think of me at Christmas. Just help yourself.
The Tony Farino Phenomenon. New Year's Day at 9:20 on BBC Two.
Secret agent Harry Palmer accepts a private mission to Finland where he stumbles on a plot to take over the world. Billion-Dollar Brain, tonight's classic Michael Caine movie at 12:55. Before that on BBC One, compliments of the season from